After I announced my engagement, my mother didn't even look at the ring. She simply smiled faintly, tapped her glass, and said, "That's lovely, dear, but speaking of wonderful news, Chloe has just landed a massive contract for her boutique." The conversation shifted instantly. I watched the light leave my own moment and shine, as it always did, on my sister. The low hum of the restaurant was a symphony of quiet celebration. The gentle clink of wine glasses, the murmur of hushed conversations, the distant laughter from a corner booth. It felt like the perfect setting, a place where good news could be carefully unwrapped and savored like the expensive meal we were about to order. Daniel's hand rested warmly over mine on the starched white tablecloth, his thumb tracing slow, reassuring circles on my skin. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of anticipation and a hope so keen it was almost painful. Across the table, my parents, Arthur and Margaret, looked on with polite expectation. My father, a retired physician, maintained an air of stoic appraisal in all situations, while my mother's smile was bright, perfectly curated, as if she were posing for a photograph I couldn't see. And next to her, my younger sister Chloe, ever radiant, was scrolling through her phone, a tiny, bored frown creasing her brow. "We have something we'd like to share," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. Daniel gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Daniel and we're engaged." I held up my hand, letting the simple, elegant diamond on my finger catch the soft, ambient light. For a fleeting second, there was a perfect, beautiful silence. My father was the first to speak. He cleared his throat, placing his napkin deliberately in his lap. "Well," he said, his tone judicious, "Daniel, a lawyer, that's a very respectable profession. A stable choice, Eleanor. Congratulations." It wasn't effusive, but from my father, it was a solid nod of approval, and I felt a small bloom of relief. But then, my mother's gaze flickered from my ring to Chloe, her smile widening into something theatrical. "Oh, that's just wonderful, dear," she chirped, her voice a little too loud. Her attention, however, had already pivoted. "Speaking of wonderful news, you simply won't believe what happened with Chloe's boutique today. Darling, tell them about the offer from the department store." Just like that, the spotlight swiveled. The moment, my moment, vanished as if it had never existed. I felt a familiar, cold weight settle in my stomach. Chloe looked up from her phone, feigning surprise, as if she and my mother hadn't rehearsed this very conversation in the car on the way over. "Oh, it's really nothing," she said, with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "They just want to carry my spring line in a few of their flagship stores. It's a huge contract, of course, a lot of pressure." "Pressure she handles beautifully," my mother interjected, beaming with a fierce proprietary pride that she never directed at me. "I am just so proud of my little entrepreneur, building an empire from scratch." I looked down at the menu, its cursive script suddenly blurring. I was a head nurse in a pediatric ICU. I spent 12-hour shifts fighting for the lives of children, managing a team under unimaginable stress, and holding the hands of terrified parents. But in my mother's eyes, my life's work was a drab gray landscape next to the glittering, imaginary empire of Chloe's chic boutique. "Congratulations, sis," Chloe finally said, her eyes briefly meeting mine. But they didn't linger on my face. Her gaze dropped to my hand, to the ring Danielle had so carefully chosen. It wasn't a look of admiration, it was a quick, sharp appraisal, as if she were calculating its carat weight and cost. A tight, polished smile touched her lips. "I'm so happy for you. It's about time someone decided to take care of you." The insult, wrapped in the guise of a compliment, hung in the air between us. Daniel's hand tightened on mine, a silent signal of support. He had seen it. He understood. I tried to smile, to say thank you, but the words felt like dust in my mouth. It was the same old story, a narrative I had lived for 38 years. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who did everything right. But Chloe was the brilliant one, the star, the one for whom the rules were always bent and the applause was always waiting. My achievements were milestones, hers were miracles. My joy was an afterthought. Looking at my family, my mother now whispering excitedly with Chloe about fabric swatches, my father methodically studying the wine list, I felt an acute and profound loneliness. This was supposed to be one of the happiest announcements of my life. Instead, it was just another reminder of my place in this family, essential but invisible. I smoothed the tablecloth with my thumb, the beautiful diamond on my finger suddenly feeling very, very heavy. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet acceptance I had cultivated over decades of being overlooked began to curdle into something else, something colder and sharper, something that tasted unmistakably like resentment. That cold knot of resentment wasn't new, of course. It was a familiar ghost, a constant companion in a family where love was not given freely but awarded like a prize. Looking at Chloe preen under my mother's adoring gaze, I was transported back to another celebration, another moment where my efforts were rendered invisible. It was my mother's 60th birthday, a milestone I had wanted to make truly special. For weeks, I had poured every spare moment into her gift. After grueling shifts at the hospital, when my feet ached and my mind was numb with fatigue, I would sit in my small apartment and knit. I'd chosen the finest cashmere yarn, a soft dove-gray wool that cost a small fortune, because I wanted her to feel wrapped in the warmth and love I so often struggled to express in words. Every stitch was a prayer, a memory, a silent "I love you." The finished sweater was, I thought, beautiful, understated, elegant, and impossibly soft. On the day of her party, I presented it to her in a carefully wrapped box. She opened it, her eyes briefly scanning the contents. "Oh, a sweater," she said, her voice holding that polite, neutral tone she used for things that didn't truly interest her. "How practical. Thank you, Eleanor." She folded the lid back onto the box and set it on a side table without so much as taking it out to feel the fabric. A moment later, Chloe made her grand entrance. "Happy birthday, Mommy," she sang, holding out a large, glossy box from a famously expensive designer. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in a pantomime of shock. Inside was a leather handbag, a gaudy, logo-emblazoned monstrosity that I knew must have cost thousands of dollars. Money I was quite sure Chloe didn't have. My mother let out a cry of pure ecstasy. She snatched the bag, holding it up for everyone to see, turning it this way and that, so the light caught the gold hardware. "Oh, Chloe," she breathed, pulling my sister into a fierce hug. "You shouldn't have, but it's exquisite, you see," she announced to the room of assembled friends and family. "My Chloe just gets me. She always knows what I truly want." She didn't look at me. She didn't see the flicker of pain in my eyes. She just saw the price tag, the status symbol. My gift, which held weeks of my life in its threads, was just a practical object. Chloe's gift, bought on credit to feed a fantasy of wealth, was a testament to love. Looking back, I realized that in that moment, the comparison wasn't just about two presents. It was about two daughters. I was the sturdy, reliable wool sweater, and Chloe was the glittering, empty designer bag. But the favoritism was more than just a matter of gifts. It was woven into the very fabric of our history, built on a foundation of lies designed to keep me indebted and Chloe blameless. The most significant of these deceptions had shaped the entire course of my adult life. When it came time for college, I knew what I wanted. Nursing was a calling for me, a path of service and stability. But the tuition was steep. I remember sitting in the living room, my acceptance letter on the coffee table, while my parents explained the financial reality. "We can only afford to put one of you through a top-tier program," my father had said, his voice heavy with reluctant authority. "And Eleanor, your path is a sure thing, a noble profession with guaranteed employment. It's the responsible investment." I felt a surge of pride, but it was immediately tempered by guilt as I looked at Chloe, who was staring at her hands with a tragic expression. It was then that my mother delivered the master stroke. She put an arm around Chloe, pulling her close. "You have to be very grateful to your sister, Eleanor," she said, her voice soft and laced with manufactured sorrow. "Chloe has made a great sacrifice for you today. She was accepted into a prestigious design program in New York, her lifelong dream. But she's giving it all up so that you can have your dream." The weight of that sacrifice settled on me like a shroud. For years, I carried it. I worked harder, studied longer, took on extra shifts, all to prove that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. Every success I achieved was tinged with the guilt that it had been built on the ashes of my sister's dream. I sent Chloe money whenever she asked, believing I owed her a debt that could never truly be repaid. It wasn't until years later, at a family wedding, that the truth came out. I was chatting with an aunt who had always been closer to Chloe. "It's so wonderful how well you've done, Eleanor," she'd said over a glass of champagne. "I remember how devastated your mother was when Chloe failed her entrance exams. She never even sent in the application to that New York school in the end. It's a blessing, really. I don't think she ever had the discipline for it." The champagne glass felt cold in my hand. The ballroom music seemed to fade away. Failed her exams? Never even applied? The sacrifice that had been the cornerstone of my guilt for over a decade was a complete fabrication. It was a lie, constructed by my mother to elevate my sister and to chain me with a sense of obligation. The betrayal was so profound, so calculating, it left me breathless. My gratitude had been a cage. My hard-earned success had been framed not as my own achievement, but as a gift given to me at Chloe's expense. And I finally understood. In my family, the truth was never as important as the story they wanted to tell. The fragile peace I had found in the wake of that disastrous dinner lasted exactly 1 week. I was at home, curled on the sofa with Daniel, a stack of bridal magazines untouched on the coffee table beside us. For a few precious days, I had allowed myself to simply be happy, to focus on the future we were building, a future that felt safe and solid. Then my phone buzzed with an incoming call, my mother's name flashing on the screen. A familiar sense of dread coiled in my gut. Daniel gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. I took a breath and answered. "Hi, Mom." "Eleanor, darling," she began, her voice dripping with a honeyed sweetness that always preceded a request. She didn't ask about Daniel or the wedding plans or how I was doing. The pleasantries were a bridge she had no intention of crossing. She went straight to the point. "I'm calling about Chloe," she said, her tone shifting to one of manufactured concern. "Her business, well, it's hit a little snag. Nothing serious, you understand, just a cash flow issue. She has a marvelous opportunity to import a new line from Italy, but she needs the capital up front." I remained silent, listening to the familiar cadence of the setup. I knew what was coming next. "We were thinking," she continued, the "we" a transparent shield for her own intentions, "that you could help her out. She needs about $50,000. $50,000. The number hung in the air, obscene in its casual delivery. I looked around my modest living room, at the comfortable but worn armchair I'd bought second-hand, at the stack of medical journals on my desk. $50,000 was not a little snag. It was a monumental sum. It was the down payment for a house. It was a safety net. It was the culmination of a decade of discipline and sacrifice. My mother, hearing my silence, pressed on, her voice taking on a new edge of entitlement. "You're her big sister, after all, and you're about to marry Daniel, a successful lawyer. It's your responsibility to help your family. Besides," she added, and this was the line that broke something inside of me, "that money you have saved up is just sitting in the bank. It's not doing anything." Not doing anything? A cold, clear rage, unlike anything I had ever felt before, rose within me. It wasn't hot and explosive, but chilling and absolute. A piece of ice forming around my heart. I thought of the endless nights I had worked double shifts, my body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. I thought of the holidays I'd missed, the vacations I'd never taken, the simple luxuries I had denied myself, all to build that small measure of security. Each dollar in that account was a ghost of a moment I had given up. And my mother, my own mother, had just dismissed my life's work as nothing. It was no longer about favoritism. It was no longer about a lack of recognition. I saw the truth with a horrifying clarity. To my mother and my sister, I was not a person. I was a resource. I was a well to be drawn from whenever they were thirsty. And they would keep drawing from it until it was completely dry. That request, that casual, cruel dismissal of my life, was the final crushing weight. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing my hurt and making excuses for their behavior, collapsed in an instant. The debt I thought I owed for a phantom sacrifice, the guilt I had carried for so long, it all burned away, leaving behind a hard, unyielding resolve. "I'll have to think about it, Mother," I said, my voice eerily calm. "There's nothing to think about, Eleanor." She started, but I cut her off. I said, "I will think about it. I'll call you back." I ended the call before she could reply. I set the phone down on the table, my hand perfectly steady. Daniel looked at me, his eyes full of concern. "What is it?" he asked softly. I looked at him, and for the first time, the victim was gone from my eyes. "It's over," I said, the words feeling like a vow. "Whatever this is, whatever they've been doing to me my whole life, it ends now." Daniel waited, his expression a mixture of patience and deep concern. He didn't rush me with questions. He simply created a space for the truth to land. I told him everything, the words spilling out not in a frantic rush, but with a strange, detached precision. I recounted my mother's casual tone, her utter dismissal of my life's work, and the impossible, infuriating demand for a sum of money that represented years of my life. "It wasn't just the $50,000, Daniel," I explained, my voice low and even. "It was the assumption behind it, the belief that my life, my work, my savings are all just a contingency fund for my sister's whims. The way she said the money was just sitting there, as if it hadn't been earned through 1,000 exhausting nights and 1,000 small sacrifices." He listened, his gaze never leaving my face. He nodded slowly, absorbing not just the facts, but the deep-seated history of injustice behind them. When I finished, he didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me I was overreacting. He took my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You're right," he said simply. "It's over." The validation in those 2 words was more comforting than any hug. "But Eleanor," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more focused, more analytical. "I'm a lawyer. My mind goes to patterns and specifics. This feels bigger than just emotional manipulation." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me about Chloe's business. How is it actually doing? Have you ever seen a business plan, financial statements?" I shook my head. I don't know. My mother just says it's thriving. Chloe posts pictures on social media of new clothes and trips to trade shows. I just assumed." "You assumed what they wanted you to assume," he finished gently. "And your family's finances in general. Who's in charge? Who managed things when your father was working?" "My mother," I answered immediately. "She always handled the bills, the investments, everything. My father trusted her completely. We all did." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, a thoughtful, calculating look in his eyes. He was connecting dots I hadn't even known existed. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice careful and deliberate. "As a couple about to get married, it's standard practice, it's smart practice, for us to get a full and transparent picture of our financial situations. Assets, debts, investments, the works. It's just good housekeeping before we merge our lives." I saw where he was going. It was a brilliant, elegant solution. He wasn't suggesting we launch an attack. He was proposing a logical, responsible step that any couple would take. "I want to help you," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Let's sit down this weekend. We'll gather all your paperwork, bank statements, tax returns, any inheritance documents you might have. We'll lay it all out. Not as an accusation, but as a fact-finding mission. You deserve to know, with absolute certainty, what your financial reality is. No more assumptions, no more stories, just the numbers." For the first time in my life, someone was offering me not just emotional support, but a strategy. He was handing me a flashlight and a map. It was one thing to feel wronged. It was another thing entirely to start looking for evidence. A part of me was terrified of what we might find, of what the stark reality of those numbers might reveal about the people I loved. But a much larger part of me, a part that had been dormant for years, felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment. He wasn't just comforting me, he was arming me with the truth. "Okay," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Let's do it. Let's see what the numbers have to say." That Saturday, Daniel's office was a sanctuary of quiet order. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the rich mahogany of his desk and the leather-bound books that lined the walls. It felt a world away from the emotional chaos of my family. We sat at a large conference table, a box of my personal documents between us. For an hour, the only sounds were the rustle of paper and the soft scratch of Daniel's pen as he made notes on a legal pad. It was methodical, almost therapeutic, transforming years of vague unease into neat, organized piles. He was looking through an old tax return from nearly 15 years ago when he paused. He tapped a finger on a single line. "What's this?" he asked, his voice casual. "The Miller Trust. It's listed here as an asset." The name sparked a dim, dusty memory. "Oh," I said, trying to recall the details. "That was from my mother's parents, my grandparents Miller. They passed away when I was in my early 20s. They left something for Chloe and me." I could almost hear my mother's voice, brisk and dismissive, from all those years ago. "It's not very much, girls," she had told us. Just a little something to help you get started later in life. It's best if I manage it for you until you're both settled. Less for you to worry about." We never questioned it. Why would we? She was our mother. Worrying about money was her domain. Our job was to be grateful. I relayed this to Daniel. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Trusts are specific legal instruments, Eleanor," he said calmly. "They have rules, designated trustees, and instructions for disbursement. It's not typically a casual arrangement." He made a note on his pad. "For the sake of being thorough, I'm going to pull the official record from the bank. It's just due diligence. We need it for our own financial planning." I nodded, but a strange, unwelcome flutter of anxiety started in my chest. It felt like walking down a familiar hallway in the dark, only to have a sudden, chilling premonition that a door has been left open that should be closed. For my entire life, I had operated on absolute faith in my mother's handling of our affairs. Now, for the first time, a sliver of doubt had entered the room, and I felt a profound, irrational fear of what we might find behind that door. A few days later, the call came. "Eleanor." Daniel's voice was low, stripped of its usual warmth. "The documents from the trust came in. I think you should come down to the office, and I think you should sit down for this." The conference room felt colder this time. The sunlight seemed harsh, clinical. Spread across the vast table were not just a few files, but stacks of official bank statements, bound with thick rubber bands chronicling a decade of history. Daniel didn't speak at first. He simply turned the first page of the top document toward me. It was the trust's initial statement of assets. My eyes scanned down to the bottom line, to the opening balance deposited from my grandparents' estate. I had to read the number twice. It was not a little something. It was a fortune, enough to buy a house outright, enough to fund a lifetime of dreams. I stared at the number, a string of zeros that seemed to mock the frugal, careful life I had led. "They told me it wasn't much," I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my own mouth. "It was a substantial inheritance, Eleanor," Daniel said gently, but his voice was edged with steel. "And this," he said, gesturing to the stacks of paper, "is where it went." He showed me the next statement, and the next. Page after page told the same sickening story. The withdrawals began almost immediately, just after Chloe turned 22. They weren't huge, single transactions. They were methodical, periodic transfers, often just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reporting. A few thousand here for inventory, 5,000 there for marketing, 8,000 for travel expenses. The amounts corresponded perfectly with the timeline of Chloe's jet-setting lifestyle and the launch of her business. My world began to tilt on its axis. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. This was calculated. Then Daniel slid a final set of documents across the table. They were copies of the withdrawal authorization slips. And on the signature line of each one, in neat, looping cursive, was my name, Eleanor Miller. "That's not my signature," I said, my voice trembling. I touched the paper, as if the ink itself could tell me its secrets. It was a close imitation, good enough to fool a busy bank teller, but it was missing the familiar stroke of my own hand. It was a forgery, a violation. The final document was a single sheet of paper. Daniel pushed it into the center of the table, and it seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was the business registration for Chloe Chic Boutique, LLC, and listed under principals were two names, Margaret Miller and Chloe Miller. The room fell away. The sounds of the city outside vanished. There was only the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, painful beating of my own heart. This wasn't just favoritism. This wasn't just neglect. This was a conspiracy. A long, patient, and devastating betrayal, orchestrated by the two people in the world I was supposed to be able to trust without question. My mother and my sister hadn't just taken my money, they had stolen my name, my identity, to fund a life of lies. And they had done it while looking me in the eye, all while I worked myself to the bone, believing I was indebted to them. The pain was not of a wound that bleeds. It was the chilling, absolute void left by a world that had just crumbled into dust at my feet. The drive home from Daniel's office was a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the route I took. I remember the feeling, a profound, hollow emptiness where a family used to be. The grief was a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made each breath a conscious effort. But beneath the grief, something else was taking root. The shock had shattered me, but in the ruins a new kind of strength was emerging, cold, clear, and unbendable. The victim who had walked into that office was gone forever. I spent the next day in a state of quiet focus, moving through the motions of my life while a meticulous, chilling plan began to form in my mind. The anger was still there, a white-hot coal deep inside me, but it no longer controlled me. It was fuel. I was no longer an actor in their play. I was about to become the director of my own. On Monday, I sat in my car during my lunch break, the hospital humming with life, just outside the window. It was time. I took a deep, steadying breath, picturing my mother's face, her practiced smile, her complete and utter lack of suspicion. I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and impatient. "Eleanor, have you thought about it?" I forced my own voice to sound hesitant, weary, like the old Eleanor she knew so well. "Hi, Mom. Yes, I have. It's a lot of money." "It's an investment in your sister," she corrected immediately, her tone sharp with reproof. "Family is the most important investment there is. You should know that." "I know," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're right, of course you're right." I paused, letting the silence hang, a final dramatic hesitation before the curtain rose on my performance. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll give Chloe the $50,000. The relief in her voice was palpable, and it was quickly followed by a wave of patronizing affection. "Oh, I knew you would," she cooed, the words a perfect echo of a lifetime of manipulation. "You've always been such a good, responsible girl, my sensible Eleanor. You see, in the end, you always do the right thing for your family." My family, I thought, a bitter irony twisting in my gut. I am doing this for what's left of it. "I'll have the bank transfer the funds tomorrow," I said, keeping my voice flat and businesslike. "Wonderful. I'll tell Chloe. She'll be absolutely thrilled." She hung up without another word, without a genuine thank you, her mission accomplished. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart a block of ice. I felt nothing but a profound and terrifying calm. A few moments later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. It didn't say, "Thank you so much. This means the world to me." It didn't say, "I owe you one, sis." It contained a single curt word, "Thanks." And below it was a web link. My finger, moving with a will of its own, tapped the screen. The page loaded to reveal a designer wedding gown. It was an extravagant confection of lace and silk, with a price tag that was nearly half of the money I had just promised her. It was a dress fit for a princess, a trophy to be displayed. I looked at the glowing screen, at the picture of the ridiculously expensive dress, bought with my stolen inheritance, and my final bitter contribution. The utter, breathtaking arrogance of it. The shameless, bottomless greed. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They didn't have to. They believed they were invincible. I saved a screenshot of the web page. It was another piece of evidence, another exhibit in the trial that was to come. I turned off the phone and looked out at the hospital. I had a job to do, lives to save. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the most important work of my life was just beginning. They thought they were celebrating a victory. They had no idea they were simply rehearsing for their own downfall. That evening, Daniel's apartment transformed from a home into a war room. The warmth of our shared life was still there. Our photos on the mantelpiece, the scent of the coffee he'd brewed for me. But the atmosphere was charged with a new, intense focus. Spread across his dining table was the arsenal we had been quietly assembling. It was no longer a collection of personal documents. It was a body of evidence. Each piece told a part of the story. The pristine, official copies of the Miller Trust Bank statements, their columns of debits a silent testament to a decade of theft. A forensic handwriting analysis report commissioned by Daniel's firm, which concluded with chilling legalistic certainty that the signatures on the withdrawal slips were skilled forgeries. The LLC registration for Chloe's Chic Boutique, stark and damning in black and white, listing my mother and sister as the sole proprietors. But we had gone further. Daniel, with the meticulousness of a seasoned prosecutor, had cross-referenced everything. We had printouts of Chloe's social media posts, a timeline of boastful filtered photographs that now looked like confessions. Here she was, posing on a balcony in Dubai. The timestamp on the photo just 2 days after $10,000 had been transferred from the trust for business travel. Here she was, preening with a new designer handbag in Paris, the purchase date coinciding perfectly with a withdrawal for inventory acquisition. It was a detailed, undeniable map of their deceit, paid for by my grandparents' legacy and my own stolen future. They never thought anyone would look, Daniel said, his voice a low, steady rumble, as he arranged the files into a precise, logical order. Their arrogance was their biggest mistake. They believed you would always be too trusting, too dutiful, to ever question the narrative they created for you. I looked at the mountain of paper, at the cold, hard facts that had replaced a lifetime of lies. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Do we just confront them? Go to the police?" Daniel shook his head slowly. A police report would lead to a criminal investigation. It would be messy, public, and they could try to paint it as a bitter family dispute. They would lie, Eleanor. They would twist the story, claim you gave them permission, that it was all a misunderstanding. It would become your word against theirs. He paused, his eyes meeting mine across the table. They thrive in the shadows of private arguments and quiet manipulation. We can't fight them on their territory. We have to bring their actions into the light, in a place where their usual tactics, gaslighting, emotional blackmail, playing the victim, will be powerless. His gaze drifted toward the elegant, cream-colored invitation to our wedding, which sat propped up on the counter. "The wedding," he said, a new steely resolve in his tone. "That's the venue. It's the perfect stage." I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up. "The wedding? Daniel, that's supposed to be our day." "It will be," he insisted. "It will be the day we start our lives together, free from all of this. But it will also be the day the truth is finally heard. Think about it. Everyone will be there. Family, friends, my father's business partners. people whose opinions your mother and Chloe care about deeply. They will be trapped, surrounded by the very community they've spent years lying to. There will be no escape. He began to outline the plan. It was audacious, theatrical, and utterly terrifying. He wouldn't just be giving a groom's speech, he would be delivering a closing argument. We would set up a projector and a screen, disguised as part of the reception slideshow of our life together. And when the time was right, Daniel would stand up, not as a son-in-law, but as an officer of the court, and he would present the evidence, piece by undeniable piece. I looked at the files spread before me. Each page was a fragment of my shattered family, a piece of the life I thought I had. To lay it all bare in front of 100 people felt like an act of ultimate destruction. But what was I trying to save? The illusion of a loving family had already been burned to the ground. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming my name, my story, my life. There was no going back. This was a war for the truth, and our wedding day was going to be the final battle. The air in the bridal suite was thick with the scent of hairspray and lilies, a cloying combination of anxiety and celebration. I sat before a large, brightly lit mirror, a stranger in a cascade of white silk, as a makeup artist made final, delicate adjustments to my face. The woman in the reflection looked serene, composed, her eyes holding a deep, still calm that felt utterly alien to me. It was the calm of a surgeon before a life-altering operation, the stillness of a deep lake before a storm. My mother and Chloe flitted about the room, their excitement a stark contrast to my own quiet resolve. They were the stars of this production, and I was merely the set piece around which they performed. You see, Eleanor, didn't I tell you this venue was the right choice? My mother said, not to me, but to my reflection in the mirror. She was adjusting the lay of Chloe's tastefully expensive maid-of-honor dress. It was Chloe who found it, you know. She has such an impeccable eye for class, for creating a sense of legacy. The word hung in the air, a grotesque monument to her hypocrisy. Chloe, busy taking a selfie that captured her own flawless makeup, glanced over. It's all about the aesthetic, Mom. And speaking of which, she said, turning her attention to me, I'm so glad you finally agreed to help with the boutique. Once that 50,000 clears, I can finally sign the lease on the new storefront in the historic district. The foot traffic there is incredible. It's going to be a game changer. She spoke of the money as if it were an overdue invoice, a simple business transaction that had finally been settled. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the supposed sacrifice. It was simply her due. My mother beamed. That's my girl, a true visionary. She then walked over to me, her expression softening into one of pitying maternal concern. She began to fuss with my veil, her fingers cool against my hair. It's a relief, really, she murmured, her voice low and confidential, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. You've worked so hard your whole life, dear. Now you'll have Daniel to handle all the difficult things. A woman shouldn't have to worry her pretty little head about finances. I looked at her face in the mirror, so close to my own. I saw the lines of calculation around her eyes, the faint, self-satisfied curve of her lips. She was looking at my reflection, but she didn't see me. She saw a problem that had been solved, an asset that had been successfully leveraged. In that moment, watching her perform this perfect pantomime of a loving mother, I felt nothing. No anger, no pain, just the cold, clear recognition of a stranger. The gesture was a perfect forgery, just like the signatures. A soft knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Eleanor. I took a deep breath, the scent of lilies filling my lungs. I rose from the chair, the heavy silk of the gown rustling around me. My mother and Chloe stopped their chatter, turning to look at me, their faces lit with triumphant smiles. They saw a bride, a sister, a daughter, walking towards a new life they had so graciously arranged for her. They had no idea I was walking towards a gallows of their own making. I looked at my reflection one last time. The woman staring back was ready. "It's time," I said, my voice even and clear. "Time to end the play." The reception hall was a masterpiece of classic elegance, a symphony in ivory and gold. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, forgiving glow over the assembled guests, who were now leaning back in their chairs, savoring the last sips of coffee and wine. The air was filled with a contented murmur, the pleasant, gentle hum of a celebration winding down. To any outside observer, it was the very picture of a perfect wedding, a family united in joy. But beneath the polished surface, a terrible and necessary violence was about to be unleashed. I sat at the head table, my hand resting in Daniel's, a silent anchor in the rising tide of my own resolve. As planned, the DJ announced it was time for the family toasts. Before anyone else could move, my mother, Margaret, was on her feet, gliding toward the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who believes every stage belongs to her. "I won't keep you long," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced, matronly warmth that made my skin crawl. "I just wanted to say how proud I am. To see my daughters both so successful in their own ways is a mother's greatest joy." She glanced briefly in my direction, a token nod before her entire focus shifted to Chloe. But I must give special credit where it is due. This entire breathtaking affair was the vision of my youngest, Chloe. From the floral arrangements to the string quartet, she poured her heart and soul into making today a testament to what our family represents: taste, elegance, and a commitment to beauty. "Thank you, darling, for creating such a perfect day." She blew a kiss toward Chloe and returned to her seat amidst polite, if somewhat confused, applause. She had managed to give the mother of the bride speech without once mentioning the groom or the marriage itself. It was a masterclass in narcissism. Next, Chloe rose, lifting her champagne flute. She looked radiant, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. She waited for the room to fall silent, commanding the attention she so clearly craved. "To my sister, Eleanor, and her new husband, Daniel," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured sentiment. "We are all so happy for you today. It takes a special kind of person to dedicate their life to service the way Eleanor has. She has always been the responsible one, the practical one." She let the word practical hang in the air for a moment, infusing it with a faint, unmistakable scent of pity. "She spent her life working so incredibly hard," Chloe continued, her eyes sweeping across the room before landing on me. "Those long hours, the endless stress, I admire it, I truly do. But I think we can all agree that a life spent under the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital doesn't exactly leave much time to cultivate, well, the more refined things in life, the subtleties of taste, of style." A ripple of discomfort went through the room. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. I didn't flinch. I held Chloe's gaze, my expression a placid, unreadable mask. Under the table, I felt Daniel's thumb trace a slow, steady circle on the back of my hand. "It's happening," the gesture said. "The bait has been laid." Chloe, emboldened by my silence, delivered her final, poisoned arrow with a dazzling smile. "But that's what family is for, isn't it? To fill in the gaps for each other." I was more than happy. to step in and make sure this day was a reflection not just of Eleanor's good heart, but of our family's standards. So in a way, you can consider this wedding my gift to you, sis. She raised her glass. May your life together be as beautiful as the party I threw for you. She took a delicate sip of her champagne. The applause that followed was sparse, hesitant. The insult, delivered with such sweet, smiling malice, had landed exactly as she'd intended, sucking the warmth from the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father, Arthur, wore a look of deep, bewildered embarrassment. I squeezed Daniel's hand. The trap was now set. The prey had walked right into it. Before the awkward silence could curdle into conversation, Daniel calmly placed his napkin on the table and rose to his feet. He walked to the microphone not with the cheerful demeanor of a groom, but with the quiet, commanding presence of a litigator approaching the bench. The room, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, fell completely still. "Thank you, Chloe," he began, his voice smooth and measured, carrying easily through the silent hall. "Your speech was very illuminating. It reminds me that a wedding is not just a celebration of the future, but also an opportunity to bring clarity to the past. And in that spirit of clarity, I feel it's the perfect moment to address a matter of family finance that has, until now, remained in the dark." A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Beside me, my mother shifted in her seat, a frown of annoyance on her face. Chloe looked merely bored. As Daniel spoke, the lights in the hall dimmed slightly. A large white screen, which had gone unnoticed against the ornate wall, descended silently from a recess in the ceiling. A projector, hidden among the floral arrangements, flickered to life. As Chloe so rightly pointed out, Daniel continued, his tone perfectly even. This beautiful celebration was, in a way, a gift. I thought it only appropriate, then, to shed some light on the source of the funds that made such generosity possible. The first image appeared on the screen. It was a crisp, high-resolution scan of a bank document. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "The Miller Family Trust." At the bottom, a number was circled in red. The opening balance. There was a collective, audible gasp from the guests who could read the figure. My mother's hand flew to her pearls. Chloe's bored expression vanished, replaced by a flicker of alarm. This trust was established by Eleanor's grandparents for the benefit of their 2 grandchildren, Daniel explained, his voice like that of a lecturer in a university hall. A substantial legacy. However, over the past decade, that legacy has been systematically depleted. The slide changed. A spreadsheet appeared, its columns detailing dates and withdrawal amounts. A river of red numbers flowing out of the account. Interestingly, Daniel noted, these disbursements began shortly after Chloe turned 22 and decided to launch her first business venture. He clicked a remote. The next slide showed 2 signatures side by side. One was a scan of my own, from my nursing license application. The other was from one of the trust's withdrawal slips. Even to an untrained eye, the differences were stark. As you can see, the signatures authorizing these withdrawals bear a passing resemblance to Eleanor's, Daniel stated. However, a forensic analysis confirms they are, in fact, forgeries. The room was now so quiet I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. I risked a glance at my mother. Her face, a moment ago flushed with pride, was now a ghastly, waxy white. Chloe sat frozen, her mouth slightly agape, a mask of disbelief hardening into pure primal panic. Daniel was relentless. The next slide showed the business registration for Chloe Chic Boutique, LLC. My mother's and sister's names were highlighted in yellow. The recipient of these funds, he announced, was a company owned and operated exclusively by Margaret and Chloe Miller. The final slide was a devastating montage. On one side of the screen, a withdrawal from the trust for $8,500 European fabric sourcing. On the other side, Chloe's Instagram post from the same week, a photo of her sipping champagne on a terrace in Rome, captioned "Living my best life." Another withdrawal for $12,000, marketing and travel, next to a picture of Chloe on a yacht in Dubai. It went on, a sickening slideshow of their lies. The presentation ended. The screen went blank. Daniel stood in the silence, his gaze fixed on my mother and sister. The guests were statues, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and disgust. I looked at the two women who had been the architects of my life's pain. I saw their masks of social grace and maternal love completely stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. And I felt no victory, only a profound, surgical sadness. This wasn't the sound of cheering or applause. This was the sound of a family breaking, irrevocably and publicly, in a silent, brightly lit room. The silence that followed Daniel's presentation was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the low hum of the chandeliers. In that moment, the 100 guests in the room ceased to be individuals. They were a single, collective witness, their faces a gallery of stunned disbelief. Then a chair scraped violently against the polished floor. My father, Arthur, was on his feet. His face, usually a mask of stoic reserve, was ashen, his knuckles white, where he gripped the edge of the table. For years he had existed in a state of willful ignorance, content to let my mother manage the family's image and finances. That comfortable blindness had just been ripped away, and the raw, unvarnished truth had left him exposed and shaking. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon my mother, not as a husband, but as a judge. "Margaret," he said, his voice a ragged, broken thing I had never heard before. "What is this? Tell me, this isn't true." My mother stared back at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The charm, the social grace, the iron-willed control. It all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a terrified, guilty old woman. She tried to speak, but only a choked, stammering sound emerged. Her entire world, the carefully constructed edifice of her reputation, had just been leveled, and she was buried in the rubble. It was Chloe who finally shattered the silence. Her face, contorted with a rage born of pure panic, was ugly and unrecognizable. She leapt to her feet, knocking over her champagne flute. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. "It's all lies. He's making it up. She was jealous. She's always been jealous of me." Her finger jabbed in my direction, trembling with fury. "She's trying to ruin my life because she could never have a life like mine." Her accusations, so potent in the private confines of our family home, sounded pathetic and hollow in this room full of evidence. They were the desperate cries of a cornered animal. Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. I felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to me, but I only saw two people, my mother now weeping silently into her hands, and my sister heaving with impotent rage. Daniel met my gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped away from the microphone, ceding the stage to me. I walked to the podium, my steps steady, the silk of my wedding dress whispering against the floor. I took the microphone, its cool, solid weight a comfort in my hand. I looked out, not at the guests, but directly at Margaret and Chloe. When I spoke, my voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried to every corner of the silent room. "There are no more lies to tell," I said, my tone calm and devoid of malice. It was the voice of a nurse delivering a difficult, unalterable diagnosis. For years I worked. I held the hands of dying children. I comforted parents on the worst day of their lives. I took on extra shifts night after night to build a future, to earn my place in the world. I paused, letting the words settle. And with the money you stole from me, the legacy my grandparents left for me, you bought handbags, you took vacations. "The price of that dress you wore," I said, my eyes locking with Chloe's, "could have paid for a month of life-saving medication for a child on my ward. I spent my life trying to save people. And the two of you spent your lives destroying your own family for things that matter so little." I placed the microphone back in its stand with a soft click. "This trial here in this room is over," I said, my voice resonating with a finality that was absolute. "But the trial of the law and the trial of your own conscience, that is only just beginning." As I turned and walked back to Daniel, I felt a lifetime of weight lift from my shoulders. It was not a feeling of triumph or of joy. It was the quiet, profound, and unshakable peace of a truth finally and fully spoken. I was no longer their victim. I was no longer their secret. I had found my voice, and with it, I had reclaimed myself. A year has passed since that day. Time, I have learned, does not erase the scars, but it does allow new life to grow around them. I am sitting on the back porch of the home Daniel and I bought together, a modest but beautiful craftsman house filled with sunlight and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built on truth. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of the roses Daniel planted in the spring. The aftermath of the wedding was swift and brutal. The facade my mother and sister had so carefully maintained didn't just crack. It disintegrated. Faced with undeniable forensic evidence and the testimony of their own community, there was no defense they could mount. Daniel, true to his word, pursued the civil case with a relentless, methodical precision. Margaret and Chloe were forced to liquidate everything: the boutique, the designer clothes, the house I grew up in. It was all sold to repay the debt they owed to the trust and to me. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The true cost was their social exile. The friends they had impressed with their borrowed wealth vanished. They were left with nothing but each other and the bitter reality of their own choices. My father, Arthur, divorced my mother shortly after the trial. It was a quiet, sad ending to a marriage built on willful blindness. He lives in a small apartment now, and he comes to visit us on Sundays. Our conversations are sometimes awkward, filled with the silences of things that can't be undone, but he is trying. He asks about my work, about Daniel, and in his eyes I see a genuine effort to build a relationship with the daughter he overlooked for so long. It's not perfect, but it's real. This morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, a little shaky. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a small town in the Midwest. I opened it to find a single sheet of plain notebook paper. It was from Chloe. The letter was short, lacking the flourish and drama that used to define her. She wrote that she was working as a receptionist in a dental office. It was a simple life, she said, hard work but honest. There were no excuses in her words, no attempts to justify what she had done. And at the bottom, in a script that seemed hesitant, were 3 words I never thought I would read: "I am sorry." I sit here now, holding the letter in my lap, looking out at the garden. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive them. The betrayal went too deep. The theft was of something far more valuable than money. but reading those words, I feel a final quiet knot loosen in my chest. Their story is no longer mine to carry. Through the open door, I can hear Daniel in the kitchen, humming softly as he prepares our dinner. The sound is simple, domestic, and profoundly beautiful. It is the sound of peace. I fold the letter and place it on the table. The sun is setting, casting a warm, golden light over the yard. I am not defined by the family I was born into, or by the lies I was told. I am defined by the choices I made, by the truth I stood for, and by the love I have found. I take a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet evening air. This, finally, is my life, and it is good.